I would talk with drummers, and they would talk about mixing.
Yeah.
And I didn't have a clue, having played with drummers for 3 decades, what they were talking about.
Yeah.
What is mixing on the drum kit?
Kind of like self-mixing. So, right, like whether you're recording or playing live, in a big enough setting, like the kit will be mic'd up, right? And all those lines are going to the soundboard, a sound engineer, whether in the studio or live. Sound engineer is going to be mixing your kit, making
Little
sure
faders, volumes.
Yeah, they got the faders, volumes. They're doing a little bit of EQ.
So
maybe
the snare
some
drum will be louder to bring the ride down.
Yeah, and it also depends what sort of music you're doing. If you're playing, jazz, maybe not so much on the snare. But if you're playing rock, we really want to hear that backbeat, for instance. But the funny thing is if your playing is not if your different elements of what you're playing are not proportionally volumed to each other.
That's a good way to say it.
Then that is going to make the sound engineer's job a lot harder. So here's an example, and this is another one of those things that really makes a drummer sound amateur to me. Like maybe they're playing cool stuff, but they're like beating the cymbals to death and barely hitting the snare. So you end up with a drummer that sounds like, it's like, all I'm hearing is just
right. That was really unpleasant.
Yeah, it's really not fun to hear. So what and if you're playing that rock, like that sort of groove, you'd want it to sound more like the latter. You want to hear that backbeat happening. So what I'm doing is I'm holding back on the hi-hat and actually hitting the snare harder than I'm hitting the hi-hat. So practicing, and really volume comes from your stick height. That's pretty much all that volume does on the drums. It's how high the stick's coming up. So by working on, especially, usually the cymbals are the things you want to kind of hold back on. For at least kind of contemporary rock, pop, country, and all that. You want to hold back on the cymbals and make sure the snare is kind of what's coming through. That's right. So you see, the stick height here is not a whole lot, but and that definitely is some work early on in the drumming, making sure that your hands are getting out of the way of each other. That's why I keep my hands really close together when I play, so that the sticks can pretty comfortably move past each other. You can really see it when I do it on the ride. You can really see a huge difference in the stick height. Probably in the front camera is really, you'll see how how short of an arc is compared to... all of that. So it's self-mixing, and the thing that's cool about that is a lot of sound engineers, studio people in particular, they'll always talk about like getting the sound as good as you can at the source.
Sure.
Before the sound even hits the microphones, you want everything sounding as good as you can. That's why
you don't want to fix it in the mix.
That's why people have these expensive recording studios full of all the best gear in the world, and they hire the best musicians to play on their records, because that's all source stuff. Getting a great musician playing a great sounding kit in a treated room, with like all the wood paneling and sound treatment and all the stuff that's going to make
the
it sound
opposite
perfect.
of this room.
Yes.
This is where sound goes to die.
Well, I like to think I'm not half bad, at least. So,